Welcome back. We are here today with Stanislav Krapivnik, former U.S. Army officer, born in Donbass and returned to Russia 15 years ago. So thank you very much again for coming back on.
No problem. Thank you. Happy New Year's for everyone, and for those celebrating Orthodox Christmas, it's still another week. So upcoming.
Yeah, Happy New Year's. And well, it seems that we're starting this new year with yet another round of escalation. This attack on Putin's residence, I thought was quite interesting because, well, for over the past 4 years, there's been a constant shift in terms of how we should define the rules of this war. So, for example, how deep can the involvement of NATO be within the category of helping Ukraine, and when does one cross into a direct war? This has been shifting as well. We see similarly what are acceptable targets. So we heard that the Europeans and Americans have been arguing for a while that the war should be taken to Russian territory. In terms of refinery, the nation of Kursk, of course, it shouldn't be taken to European territory. But importantly, the political leaderships seems to have been largely exempted from this war, and it seems to me that Russia has had some opportunities to take out Zelensky or other parts of the Ukrainian government, but has kind of put this outside what would be considered acceptable targets. So I was wondering, though, how do you see this changing the nature of the war for Russia, but also the diplomatic path?
Well, let's begin with that. Political leadership should be outside the war, and it's only been one-sided. Let's just begin with that. That's flat out. And it's been the side of the Russian side, and this has been coming under more and more criticism, and now the criticism's flying high. It's on the radio stations. People want strikes. They want Zelensky destroyed. They want his people around him destroyed. And this is on commentary this morning. I was in the car listening to it on FM. People think that, well, at least the West tries to portray that Vladimir Putin is a dictator. Everybody kowtows same line. Far from it. What's scary to the should be scary to the West, if they're any bit IQ higher than a snail, is the fact that Vladimir Putin is holding back a lot of destruction that could easily fall on the West. Anybody else, me included, if I was in his place, I would have been striking much harder and further into the West by this point to get the message across. And if it doesn't get across, call it a warmonger, what have you. But I think that's the problem: is the West has gotten, and Zelensky as part of that West, as the forwardmost part of that West, has gotten very comfortable. They're going to be exempt from everything, no matter what they do. And they continue up the ante till the point where they're going to get hit, and they're going to get hit hard, and it could easily escalate into a nuclear conflict, in which case Europe will be just exterminated. But for the simple reason is, it doesn't take much for Europe to go into a radioactive hellhole, because Europe is very compact. So if Russia was to strike only the American bases that have nuclear weapons on them, the heavy bombs, the glider bombs, that alone would be enough to cover most of Europe in nuclear fallout. It's just a fact of geography. America, Russia have huge open areas, large distances between cities. Europe is extremely compact population-wise. So any hit in Germany will have fallout all the way up into Scotland and Ireland, guaranteed. I mean, we saw that in Chernobyl. When Chernobyl blew, and by the way, the Ukrainians, aka the European, well, I won't say Europeans. I hate saying that. We own a third of Europe. We were in Europe long before as R1A Hopla group. We were there long before the R1Bs, and the R1Bs are the Germans. So we own a third of Europe. We have been here longer than the Germans have been here, and the Scandinavians and many other nationalities. Maybe the Celts are here longer than us. So I'm not going to say Europe. That's just very incorrect. The European Union and NATO. As we saw when Chernobyl blew, the fallout reached Scotland. And for 10 years, the Scots were told not to graze their cattle up in the highlands, or their sheep in this case, up in the highlands, because it was radioactive fallout that was building up in the moss and other organic matter. And that was just from a nuclear power plant that never went critical, by the way. It never went critical because 3 men sacrificed their lives went underneath the nuclear power plant and manually drained the water reserves. Because if it had gotten in there, if it had melted all the way down, there would have been a massive steam explosion that would have covered much of Central and Eastern Europe and probably gotten much more into Western Europe. And the West is trying to do this again on purpose with attacks on the Zaporozhye power plant, with previous attacks on the Kursk power plant. So the West seems to be absolutely the European Union's leadership, with a few exceptions. The Austro-Hungarian Empire seems to have the only sanity left in the EU, the modern EU. The rest of them don't seem to understand where this is going. So they have tried several occasions to attack directly Vladimir Vladimirovich. There was if we remember, in 2022 or 23, there was a drone that flew in and hit the Kremlin. It's just that the anti-aircraft systems were upgraded heavily all around the edges of Moscow and internally with Panzer systems, and the big rocket systems are held externally. There's been several assassinations, flat out assassinations, including civilian casualties outside of the assassination target, and of civilians too. While we were at it, of poets, of Dugin's daughter, other people have been assassinated. Journalists have been murdered by the Western regime in Ukraine. I mean, the number of journalists that have been killed is innumerable. In fact, the journalists no longer wear press badges. They don't wear press badges. They don't wear the dark blue that journalists normally wear, because that makes them target number one for the Western regime that is in Kiev. So this is not a first time. The question is, how long will Moscow continue to not retaliate in a full manner? Because the voices of criticism inside of Russia are very loud. And what the West doesn't seem to understand is, believe you me, if they ever get rid of Vladimir Vladimirovich, they're going to be they're going to be regretting every second that comes after it, and there won't probably be that many seconds, because the people that are going to take power afterwards are going to make them extinct. There are very hard right, wing people waiting in the wings are going to come after it, and that's going to be revenge. And it's going to be revenge not on Ukraine. It's going to be revenge on the rest of the EU and NATO countries involved in this. So, that this happened, I'm not surprised in the least. It's now a matter of what's going to happen afterwards. What's going to be the next step from Moscow?
Yeah, yeah, I've been making that argument for the past decade, actually, that the idea that Putin is this tyrant, that this is a very dangerous thing to keep telling ourselves, because it assumes that the alternative to Putin would be some kind of a pro-Western Yeltsin-like figure. But again, it's worth noting that the criticism often against Putin in Russia has been, even from Dugin's point of view, that he's too liberal, but also the more general public has been that he's been a bit too moderate, pro-Western to a large extent. I outlined that argument back in 2016 in this Australian think tank, where I wrote, Putin is the last pro-Western alternative. but it is true, though. He did want a settlement into a greater Europe. But of course, what comes after Putin, the Europeans probably wouldn't like very much, neither the Americans. But how do you think this might affect the demands of Russia, though, in the negotiations? Because this is something that Sergei Lavrov made a point out of, that not only would Russia retaliate heavily against this, because I do think that the Russians are aware that they always face this dilemma. When there's an escalation, either you retaliate and you risk direct war, or you don't retaliate, but then you embolden the opponent to go further. So there's no good solutions. But yeah, Lavrov said there will be retaliation. I interpret it as against the Ukrainian targets, but also that this would impact Russia's demands in the negotiations. How do you see this? And was this a Ukrainian, European, U.S. intelligence agencies sabotaging the peace negotiations?
Oh, I'm sure that MI6 played a good role in this, possibly CIA. Many people think the CIA is some kind of control organization. I would say it's a fractured fiefdom. First of all, the CIA itself went rogue about day one, maybe day two. Kennedy, as a matter of fact, wanted to bring the CIA to bear. Uh, that may have been one of the reasons he was killed. As a matter of fact, there were other presidents, other government bodies that wanted to put some kind of control in the CIA. Nobody's been able to do it. The CIA does whatever it wants. And there's a big question how much even the central office has control over its various houses, CIA House and various European countries and so on. So it's a very big question about what the role of CIA is. I think MI6 is much more controlled, but it's also much more, um, how should I put it, psychotic. It's ready to play the game to the extermination of England. These people, I think, have lost the plot quite a bit. Either they don't understand where this can lead, or they don't think that actually anything will ever happen to that, to the mother country in this case, which is an amazing thing to consider, all things considered. Uh, but arrogance and ignorance, they usually go hand in hand, unfortunately. And a lot of these people live in an echo chamber. Uh, they only hear back what they're thinking from their fellows because they all think the same. It's groupthink that leads to that arrogance and that ignorance. And we see that in the European Union on a constant basis. And as far as, yes, as far as Vladimir Vladimirovich, he is liberal compared. I mean, he's gotten more conservative, but he is liberal compared to even on the average of Russian society. And he's always been very pro-European. If again, he's been forced to move away from that, but he's constantly trying to integrate into Europe. But if we look at realistically the last 140 years, 150 years, the first League of Nations proposal came from Nicholas II, the same czar that tried to keep everybody from starting World War One. Everybody wanted the glorious war. 48, Stalin wanted to join NATO. That was being formed in 49. Quite grasping the fact that he was the target of NATO. Yeltsin asked to join NATO. Putin joined NATO. So there's been overtures from the Russian side toward the West for 140 years. They've all been not just rebuffed, but viciously militarily rebuffed on many occasions. So I think whoever comes next is going to make Putin seem like an absolute pacifist. And Europe doesn't seem, well, again, Europe, the European Union and the NATO countries don't seem to understand it. I think several European NATO countries do well understand that. I think the insanity is strongest running from Poland to the UK across Northern Europe, the Scandinavian lands, and the pre-Baltics. But the pre-Baltics, the pre-Baltics, you need to consider they have nothing to sell and no way to make money outside of selling themselves as a Platzdarm to start a new war. That's one. And two, all of their leadership has a second passport. They're not going to stick around to die in place. They're going to be in England. They're going to be in the US. They're going to be anywhere but in the pre-Baltics. The peasants can go fight or get run over by the Russian army once we get this big war going. We're going to go where real people go. The really white people go, as they say, as opposed to you local, it translates better Russian. But escalation is got to come. I think it's gotten to the point where the Kremlin very well realizes letting anything slide is only going to make it worse. And they've let things slide for 4 years. There should have been much worse retaliations and into possibly the NATO bases on the edge of Ukrainian territory in Poland and in Romania, from which a lot of these attacks are coming. Look, we've even had drone attacks directly out of Estonia. Those drones coming into Pskov were not flying in from Ukraine. In fact, about 3 months ago, they had a drone crash, a big airplane-style drone crash in the middle of Estonia. Tarta, I think was the name of the province. And the Estonians just scream Russians. They try to shut it down and hush it up. But the local people there took photos, and the photos went straight to the internet, of course, like all photos do these days. And yes, these were Ukrainian-type drones, airplane-style drones. So they're either flying through the pre-Baltics, which makes Estonia part of the war, or they're being launched from Estonia. Whether it's Estonians or Ukrainians, it doesn't matter. Estonia is part of the war. It's aggressing against Russia. And we could probably say the same thing for Latvia while we're at it, maybe Lithuania. So there you go. It's already on. It's just being ignored. It's been ignored, or it's been actively ignored by the Kremlin, so as not to expand the war. Though I think it's getting to the point where sooner or later there's not going to be any choice but to expand the war, because the West, particularly, well, in this case, the West, I won't say Putin. I mean, I'm sorry, Putin. I won't say Trump, and I won't say the Americans, even though I think a good chunk of the Trump administration and the intelligence agencies are all for it. But the Western Europeans are gun ho on starting a big war. They just want it to start it a little later. But I think they're going to get dragged into it through their own stupidity, unfortunately. And the only way to stop that is for the people of those countries to remove the cancer in their capitals and put somebody rational in power. And voting is not going to happen because outside of the Czechs, which were, I was very surprised that Babic was elected. We've seen what the average European election is like. It's cheating. It's autocracy. It's absolute. We'll make the rules as we go, and you don't get a say in it. Unfortunately, and just one comment on autocracy while we're at it. They all love to scream Russia's an autocratic state. There was a very good comparison that came out. How many people were arrested in Russia in 2025 for online commentary? It was 400 people in a country of 150 million. 400 people, and it's a question about how many of them actually went to trial, let alone if anybody went to jail. Versus the UK, which has less than half the Russian population, 14,000. So if we adjusted it for population, it'd be about almost 30,000 people that were arrested, and most of them went to jail, getting 2, 3, 4 year sentences for commentaries like "I'm tired of immigrants." Okay, whether it's a nice comment or not a nice comment, supposedly these people have freedom of speech. That's freedom of speech. They're not screaming for revolution. They're not screaming for murder the immigrant or something of that sort. They're stating they're tired of immigrants, or stating that the politicians are idiots. Which, by the way, in Germany, what Merz has 8,000 cases that he opened against people criticizing him online, hurting his feelings. So again, where's the autocracy?
Well, another area though where we seem to be moving towards not just an intensification of the front lines, but also further escalation, even widening the war, would be the attacks on different energy and maritime infrastructure. That is, we see that the targets, of course, of the energy infrastructure goes a bit both ways. That is, Ukraine and NATO are targeting Russian energy, not just through sanction, but also attacks on refineries, now also attacks on civilian vessels. And as we saw in the Mediterranean, it's hard to imagine that, of course, Ukrainians acted alone. This seems highly unlikely, but of course, the Russians are also going after Ukrainian energy and ports to reduce Ukraine's capabilities to attack in the Black Sea. What do you see now being the strategy on the Russian sides? Because I heard many warnings coming out of Russia that if its assets are attacked in the Black Sea, then the natural reaction would be to sever Ukraine from the Black Sea. But how are you reading all of these attacks occurring now, especially in the Odessa region? Because it's not just energy infrastructure. We see the ports, bridges. It's quite, it's been very, well, I guess, defining of the past 2 months.
Well, let's begin with the fact that this isn't Ukraine attacking. There may be a Ukrainian somewhere in the group, but this is the UK. Flat out, this is British intelligence. This is British drones, even if they slap "made in Ukraine" on those drones. What's interesting is some of the targets that they hit. So the Turks have been made to look fools because shipping is being hit inside their exclusive economic zone. One of the ships that was sunk was actually carrying sunflower oil. Not sure how much of an ecological disaster that'll be, but it's not fuel, at least. So we'll see. Maybe fish eat sunflower oil. But there was a lot of it that was leaked. So luckily, the 2 oil tankers that were hit were empty. They were coming in for fueling. But the interesting thing is they were heading. First of all, they were under third country flags. They were heading toward Novorossiysk. And the damage in Novorossiysk is interesting even more because this wasn't Russian facilities that were hit. This was the Caspian Transit Consortium that was hit. Uh, Earlier this year in the summer, their offices were hit by Ukrainian drones. Another port facility of theirs was hit. And this time, their loading facility was hit and destroyed. It's no longer being, it's not capable of being fixed. And who owns the CTC? Well, Russia does have a small stake in the CTC, but the CTC is owned first and foremost by Kazakhstan, who has been putting their behinds on two seats. We'll be friendly with Russia, and we'll hold all the sanction regimes to somewhere in between. Oh, and we'll help feed Ukraine. Well, you get what you get when you help feed Ukraine. Turkey got the same thing. So now they can't export the majority of their oil because that's where most of their oil went. So they're losing billions. It may bankrupt the government because that government literally does live off of oil and gas. Who else owns that? Oh, the U.S. owns that. So American assets have now been destroyed by the British. I'm not sure how much of a how much of a conflict that's going to cause, but I'm sure Americans weren't too thrilled to find out that their facilities that they helped pay for are now longer operable and will not be operable in any of the near future, which cuts down into American oil imports and American revenues. Interestingly enough. So I'm sure that's probably fit into Trump's position at least somewhat, because Trump does represent the oil lobby as well. He hears from them and he represents them. They are powerful in the U.S. What else has been hit? So a Chinese tanker has been hit, and that was in the Mediterranean heading to Russia to fuel up in Russia. So at this point now, we're starting to hit the really, it's no longer just Russia being drawn into this war, but the Europeans. Because let's admit it, I mean, where the Western Central Europeans are doing this, it's not the Ukrainians. Unless the Ukrainians have free travel with weaponized equipment through Greece. We're talking about Greece, more likely is where these drones came from. How do you find a tanker in the middle of the sea to bring a drone in before its fuel reserves go? Satellites. You have satellite data. If it's not the U.S. giving the satellite data, the EU has more than a few satellites over the area, including the UK, that are given that can give live satellite feeds where these tankers are located. Again, it's one thing if it's in a port; it's a whole different thing. It's out to sea. Sea is a big place. People don't realize that oftentimes when they look at a map and see, oh, see, there's a map, there's a little tanker about icon there. Yes, but that's millions of square kilometers of water. Try finding that with a drone. Especially a surface drone trying to find it, let alone even the air drones. The air drones that were used are not that long distance capable, so they're not going to be hovering around looking for this tanker out in the open sea for very long. They came in hard in basically a swarm outfit. So what the Russian government has already said is for all tankers coming to Russia to reflag to Russian flags. So far, they've been hitting third country flags. Reflag Russian flags, that's an act of war against Russia. Go ahead and hit us. If it's a British, then it's a declaration of war by the British. If it's Bulgaria doing it or Romania doing it, it's a declaration of war by Bulgaria and Romania on the high seas. So we'll see how that works. Alternatively, especially in the north, across the Baltic Sea, the Russian shipping is going to be, it's already had this done once or twice with military escorts. So probably run convoys with military escorts ready to fire in any any EU or NATO ship that's trying to block them or trying to land on. So I mean, this is a wartime, and now we're going further and further into wartime effects. And believe me, if there was a convoy, there'll be submarines somewhere around there too, just as it added firepower. So if the Western European powers really want a war, I mean, they're really itching for a war, they'll get a war. I hope they're not. I hope there's some amount of sanity left in whatever's inbred elites are sitting in the European Commission, non-elected elites. But unfortunately, I think we are heading to a bigger war, at least a bigger conglomeration that will spark something that may stop at just a spark, or it may continue burning and then turn into a wildfire. Hope I'm wrong.
Yeah. Well, I think that assessment might be correct because you probably saw the interview or the speech Putin gave in his military fatigues, and he essentially made this talk that our interest in this deal of Ukraine pulling out of Donetsk, it's close to zero now in terms of our interest. So, in other words, the former deal appears to be going away as they will ramp up. And U.S. General Michael Flynn, he went out tweeting that the best war plans leave a lot of options open because you want to have all these alternatives, different paths to go until the last minute. That's when all the other alternatives are taken off the plate and you go for one thing. And he seemingly interpreted that this is what Putin is now doing by simply observing Putin's appearances in terms of how he's dressed and also the content of his speech. That well, as Michael Flynn's words, the ambiguity is now gone, and it appears that the policies will change dramatically. I guess my main concern is when I look around Europe. I mean, most people, I don't think see the severity of the direction we're going down. Even when I remember back earlier this year when there were attacks on Russia's nuclear deterrent, kind of the consensus across the media was, well, Ukraine has a right to strike back. They were attacked by Russia. Why shouldn't they respond against the planes that attack them? But I don't think they understand the significance. First of all, attacking the nuclear deterrent of Russia in a proxy war. And the FSB even recognized that the British were, well, deeply involved in this attack as well, on Russia's nuclear deterrent. I mean, this is this is almost unthinkable during the Cold War that anyone would go to this extent. And but they're only talking in these normative ways that, oh, well, what is fair? Russia did this to Ukraine. It's not fair. Ukraine should be able to attack back. But when you look at who's behind the attacks and what they're attacking, this is really World War III stuff we're talking about. And so we're going up this escalation ladder, and people are talking about this as their children. It's quite frightening. I think a lot of belligerence is making way because of a lot of stupidity which is covering over. It's yeah. I think in such a war, everyone would effectively lose. But how do you make sense of this speech by Putin? Do you see now that the policies will begin to harden? Of course, it depends on these negotiations, but I'm not sure if they're just for show. It doesn't seem to make much sense. I'll have to say though, I heard 90%, according to the US side of the peace deal, was done, except for the NATO stuff and the territory stuff. so essentially the core of the matter.
Yeah. Market Garden, they got 90% of the way. That last bridge was the bridge too far. As the movie, as the books, it was the bridge too far. So yeah, if 90% is on flat ground, the last 10% is Mount Everest, and you just can't climb Mount Everest. That's the whole point. It doesn't matter if it's the 1%. If you have a point where neither side will move, everything gets settled on a battlefield. Problem is for the West, in particular for the U.S., the leverage of these negotiations is evaporating every single day by square kilometers and quite a few square kilometers every single day, and with thousands of dead Ukrainian soldiers every single day without exception. Let's just review the what is happening on the battlefield right now. So Migrated is over. There's just cleanup operations and a few holdouts here and there. The Pokrovsk relief operation never really got going before it got whacked because it was coming up. So I mean, it's the videos coming out of there. These guys are just basically destroyed driving down roads trying to speed in. What Gulai Pole, when it fell in 2 weeks, basically. It fell so quickly, the last part, the Ukrainians took off running so quickly that when the Russian forces overran the headquarters units, the computers were on. They weren't even password protected. They didn't have time to block the screen, let alone destroy the computers. That screen's on, they just ran. So the videos were showing these computers, all these monitors are still on. Come in there, see what they're talking about. You got full access. switch off the password control right there, and start digging in on their intel. So that means that basically morale just collapsed instantly. And as the forward units started running, and they were running past the headquarter units, and the headquarter units said, "Oh crap! Now we're the forward units. Let's run." When panic hits that hard, that means it's entire collapse of any discipline, of any control. That you do not destroy your equipment, you don't burn documents, you don't evacuate them. I mean, in a headquarters unit, if you got a top secret computer, that computer is much more valuable than any rifle anybody else in that unit, because one guy can get killed. That's a tragedy. That computer gets lost. That could get a lot of people killed. Plus, whatever secrets you're holding that probably should never be leaked to the world. So all these computers were up and running. So that tells you that morale has totally collapsed. Now, what is Gulay Polya? North of Gulay Polya is about a 50-kilometer, maybe actually less than that, zone of fortifications that's now been flanked from the north, is now flanked from the south. So if the Ukrainians stay in those fortifications, they die. If they make a run for it, most will die. Some will get through because it's closing out. But the problem is for them, running is now across mostly open terrain. And here we start the problem for the Ukrainian side, that most of Zaporozhye is flat and open. They lost their eastern flank totally. Total collapse of the eastern flank. The main fortress being Gulay Polya, which, by the way, it's two words combined to one, Gulay and Polya. Everybody keeps pronouncing it, and for some reason, Gulay Polya. Gulay Polya, which means tumbleweed in English, if you translate that. So the city of tumbleweed. They've from here to Zaporozhye city is 60 kilometers straight shot. So you still have Ukrainian forces on the south trying to hold the Russian forces that are advancing north, while north of them is going to be a breakthrough by Russian forces moving to the north of them. So they either fall back or they get destroyed. It's surrounded and destroyed, hit from three sides. It's just going to roll up that entire defensive line. They are Zaporozhye. I'm not going to call it lost. I mean, it is lost. But the Zaporozhye front, I'm not going to say how long it takes. It depends how fast Russia decides to move. The weather there is pretty atrocious. It's not frozen. We've just now gotten actual winter in Moscow, and it's come with a vengeance, snowing every day. But down there, it's freeze, defrost, freeze, defrost, mud, a lot of mud. So that's going to save them somewhat, because heavy equipment is still going to be sluggishly moving across that kind of terrain. But the fact is, Russia has their dominance. Russia has missile dominance. Russia has in areas heavy drone dominance. It doesn't have FPV drone dominance, but it can concentrate a lot of FPV assets in a single area. And Russia has armor dominance. And in this case, it's outmaneuvering from a three-directional attack. It's just going to roll up their front. So I would, if I was a guessing man or a betting man, better yet, I'd say anywhere from 2 to 3 months, and most of Zaporozhye front will be collapsed and destroyed completely. Probably Zaporozhye city being either under siege or invested or partially invested. It's very hard to defend Zaporozhye city. It's in an open, flat area. Has one major bridge across the Dnieper. It can be. You can, of course, come down the eastern the eastern bank of the Dnieper and continue overland, but you're in an open area. So anything coming in from the north side is going to be subject to a lot of attrition. Then we look at the Donbass itself, or in this particular case, the Donetsk People's Republic. And again, the front, we have 100-kilometer frontage that's basically open. That goes right into Poltava and right into Dnipropetrovsk Oblast. The last fortifications are gone. The last major fortifications, new fortification belts that they're digging desperately, are mostly in open fields, unprepared villages, and they don't have the manpower. You look at Kupiansk; they threw everything they could, and if you notice, every offensive is getting so much smaller. You had the in 23, in end of 22, you had Kharkov, and you had Kherson counteroffensives. In 23, you had Zaporozhye counteroffensive, was already a lot smaller because they lost a lot of men and equipment. There they lost basically their second army. rebuilt army, the second rebuild. Then you've had the Kursk offensive. That if you ever actually looked at the Kursk offensive, not the maps that the West put out, but an actual map, you saw that they captured 10% of the oblast. It's far from the biggest Russian oblast. So that really was actually a relatively small piece of ground, all things considered. Even though the West was blowing panic, like tomorrow, Kursk City, which was still like 50 kilometers away from them, and the day after it'll be Moscow. But the reality was everything's getting smaller and smaller in scope, and now the big counteroffensive was just Western Kupets, and that's over, and that's been destroyed, and Russian forces are already moving past Kupetsk in the south of Kupets. So the whole front is collapsing. Once Krasnoyarsk is fully cleared, you'll have Slavinsk basically surrounded from the north. And that conglomeration of there's fighting going on in Konstantinovka. So you've got two major cities left that are not invested yet at all, and one that's about a third invested. So what's left? The Donbass is done, and after this, it's just a matter of how much territory in Sumy, in Chernogov. Chernogov hasn't been started yet, but in Sumy, in Kharkov, in Dnieper, and sooner or later in Dnipropetrovsk, and sooner or later in Poltava is going to be in Russian hands. And Kharkov, let's not forget, that's about 30 kilometers, and Russia's moving. Sumy's the Russian front has started moving again. That's less than 20 kilometers to Sumy. I mean, we're not talking huge distances to surround these cities. And with the power out, most of the civilians are going to leave if they haven't already left. They can't survive. The cold is arriving, the actual winter cold. Kharkov is much colder than going down to Avdiivka. There's a big enough distance there and a difference. A lot of people will leave, and that's the whole point in this case. Switching those areas off is to get the people to leave, because then fighting in that city is going to be much more, much easier without the Ukrainians being able to use the civilians as human shields.
I think that the command post being abandoned in this way in Gallipoli was an indicator of what will come, because we always see this, that when wars enter their final stages, casualties always goes through the roof, much like Germany at the end of World War II. And it, as you suggest, this is always this cascading effect. If there's panic, there's more desertions, there's going to be less recruitment, there's going to be more surrenders, there's going to be the disconnection of communication lines, weakening supply lines, international support is pulling back as nobody wants to bet on the losing horse. And you can kind of see where this goes, and it's kind of frustrating that it doesn't seem to affect very much, at least in Europe, the way they look at the way they should approach this conflict in terms of at least starting to talk to the Russians, pick up a phone. I mean, we should, at some point, things will change so fast from day to day. We wish we would have some people on the ground talking and been in the middle of at least a process. Instead, everything would have to start from scratch, and then once we start from scratch is after we actually lost, which is it boggles the mind. But it did make me want to ask you about the U.S. position. How do you make sense of the U.S. position in these negotiations? Because Trump is, of course, famous for going a bit back and forth, and it also seems a bit bizarre, the U.S. position, because now the U.S. is seemingly the main negotiator trying to bring this war to an end. But it was the U.S. that pushed the Europeans back in 2008 on offering future membership to Ukraine. It was the U.S. who took the lead in toppling Yanukovych in 2014. It was the U.S. that took the lead in undermining the Minsk peace agreement and then the Istanbul talks. And today it's the U.S. generals doing most of the war planning. Ukraine is full of CIA agents. It's the U.S. intelligence agencies giving the targeting, primarily using American weapons. And this is still a U.S.-led proxy war, irrespective of Trump trying to give it over to Biden. So yet Trump is the mediator here. He might be genuine, though, that he wants this war to end as he sees a disaster, or he could just be trying to outsource it to the Europeans. But even as he mediates, though, the sanctions on countries like India are being imposed in efforts to cripple the Russian economy, and he either ignores or assists the Europeans in attacks on Russia. So there's even the civilian vessels. So I mean, you are a former U.S. Army officer. How do you make sense of the U.S. position in this? Well, let's call it a diplomatic circus, because this it doesn't feel very genuine to me that if they would want to shut this thing down, they could. And I do understand that they don't want to give up the pressure yet against Russia, as they can use this as leverage in any negotiations. But still, it's been a year of the Trump administration, and they're still leading this war. So, what are we looking at here?
For future historians, say in 150 years, 200 years, before they start studying these last 5 years and probably or last maybe even longer, if you really want to go back to where it starts and the next couple of years where it goes, I would highly suggest binging on Monty Python's Flying Circus, because this is basically like the most absurd episode of Monty Python's Flying Circus. For those that haven't watched this, maybe I'm dating myself, but I highly suggest watching some reruns and then watching the news. It will make much more sense. The absurd of the absurd is what we have from the West in general. Uh, you know, Anybody with half a intellectual node in their head would have figured out that one of the biggest targets of all of this was the European Union to begin with, the destruction of the European Union, the willful self destruction of the European Union. And that's exactly what we have. Um, Europe, the European Union is not going to negotiate. They're negotiation incapable. What they're going to do until they collapse is become more and more tyrannical. We see this right now. Sanctioning of European citizens, sanctioning of Swiss citizens. For what? For telling the truth. For telling the truth of what is going on. This is, you know, the USSR and their unelected Politburo, otherwise known as Commissioner van der Leyen, or the State Secretary van der Leyen. There, um, actually, I think the Politburo had more of a democratic process in getting elected than the European Commission. They have taken everything that was worst about the USSR, and implemented that, and none of the good things like taking care of the people, 48-hour work weeks, vacations for people, medical treatment for people. They just dropped all of that anchorage. Why bother with that ballast? We'll just keep the good stuff. How we rule tyrannically over everybody. So I don't think they're capable of negotiating. The people definitely around Vander Lane are, and I don't think the people that could replace her are capable of that. They are ideologues. They have sold themselves uh, fully their souls to this mission, whether they realize it or not. But that's exactly how they're acting. And people can do that very easily. They get so invested in something that they cannot take that one step back, let alone the 10 step, and you take back and take a look at the big picture. That Europe was always the one of the major targets. It's like, World War One, World War Two. The British aim wasn't just the destruction of the Germans; it was the destruction of the Germans and the Russians. They were playing a bigger game. The U.S. is playing a bigger game in this. That the U.S. is now playing both the main controller and the empower of the proxy, and the guys that are the neutral negotiators. Again, this is something straight out of Monty Python. I don't think Monty Python going to come up with something this hilarious. And you're looking at people, Trump is talking about we're neutral. You're neutral. You're giving them all the military intelligence they need. You're still giving them equipment. Yeah, the U.S. is still sending equipment for money that Europe someday will pay, maybe. So they're still providing equipment. There's even line items in the direct Pentagon budget for Ukraine. It was modest, of course, compared to previous years. It was only about $800 million, but it's there. And there's always supplemental budgets. They never forget that the U.S. military and the U.S. government in general runs on a lot of supplemental budgets. So if it's $900 billion is the main budget for the War Department, the supplemental budgets could easily come to several $100 billion more easily, and they'll be ad hoc passed here and there. So you're looking at a side that really is trying just to hedge its bets. I don't think it's given up on Project Ukraine as a whole, no matter what Trump is saying. I don't believe. Sorry, maybe a lot of Russian news media don't like what I've had to say before, because I am very critical on Trump, and they all for some reason want to believe that maybe this time with the U.S. President Trump and something like that. Well, like, gentlemen, this is, ladies and gentlemen, this is not the end. This is only a, if nothing else, a regrouping. Project Ukraine has not been abandoned. The U.S. has not abandoned its desire on hegemony over the world, no matter what its new strategy, official strategy is. And if you look at the official strategy, they still talk about possible threats to Europe and to other areas where they can't leave totally because our interests are still involved. What meanwhile, just reinforcing that we're going to rape the Western Hemisphere as much as we want, like we've done for the last 140 years before that. So where's this going to go? I don't know. I honestly don't know. From the Russian side, I think that they're finally just running out of any desire to even participate in this farce. It's going to be settled on the battlefield. What's going to happen to the European Union? I think at least a few countries are probably going to go, thanks, we've had enough, we're leaving. Will they be allowed to leave like the British were? I don't know. The European Union was much more democratic when the British had their exit. Would the Hungarians or the uh, Slovakians be able to leave? I don't know. I honestly don't know at this point, because if they start to go, that could have a cascading effect on the European Union as a whole. And those powers that be that are sitting up in Brussels, they don't want to lose power. And the more power they grab, the more desperate they become. Let me just look at what they're doing to European citizens. Again, sanctions inside of their own countries. They can't buy, they can't earn, they can't sell, they can't have gifts. I mean, this is worse than putting somebody in a concentration camp. Or at least worse than putting them in a prison. At least in prison, he gets food and board. Here, you're a non-entity that can't do anything. So a union never came up with anything that tyrannical. Well, I'm not going to talk about the 1920s, the 30s when they had gulags, but I'm sure those are probably on around the corner. That's usually the next step. Well, we can't keep these people in if they're ghosted. We can't keep them in society because they're still talking. They're still coming on podcasts. Why don't we just put them all in one place? And then the next logical steps go from that. We know how this play plays out. It's been played out several times before, and I don't see the European Union hitting the brakes anytime soon. I don't see the desire.
Well, the U.S. playing all sides is a common theme, though. In 1941, before Harry Truman took the presidency, there's this quote he had in the New York Times where he said that, if the Germans are winning, we should help the Russians. If the Russians are winning, we should help the Germans, and that way let them kill each other as many as possible. And this is
Yes.
kind of the, as long as both are weakened, we win. And again, and it's not exactly the same now, but the logic is still the same. You can destroy, for example, Nord Stream. You weaken the Europeans, and in their weakness, make them more dependent on the U.S., make them more obedient. I mean, look where the EU is now. 20 years ago, in terms of GDP, there was some parity between the U.S. and the EU. Now, there's nothing. What remains of a deindustrializing Europe is being now lured over to the United States with all these subsidies, and it's quite remarkable. And as the Europeans are allowed the privilege of buying American weapons to fight a war, which the Americans were the main one pushing for, all the Americans want in return is for Europeans to buy American energy, much, much more expensive. And what remains of money should be invested in the United States, as per a deal the EU had to sign with Trump on his golf course, given that the EU didn't have any leverage. So there is, and again, this hardly falls under a conspiracy theory when Trump himself comes out and say the EU is worse than China, and he hates nothing more than China, seemingly. So that would be the European. So it is quite remarkable, but it does beg the question: what do you think is how do you interpret the European position? Because this is a very strange thing for me, because the Europeans, again, they're the one, as said before, resisted the U.S. push towards this disaster in 2008 when they warned Bush that don't offer membership to Ukraine. First of all, there's only 20% of them who want it, and it's going to be war. Angela Merkel said this. This will be interpreted by Moscow as a declaration of war. And the predictable thing happened. It blew up in our faces. We have a war. We're losing that war. The U.S. is really sees what's written on the wall, so they're backing out. not completely, obviously, but handing over responsibility to the Europeans and try to make some money of it as they outsource it. It's just, and there's no course correction. It is just, it's quite shocking. And I always feel like I should make some excuses for the EU, but after what they did to Colonel Jacques Beau of the Swiss army, like if you read his books, watched his interviews, he just relies on Western sources to give the best analysis, which was his job as a colonel. He did the intelligence analysis, and then based on interpreting reality as it is, advocates for the best policies. His assessments have been correct. No one can catch him on any of the facts or the analysis he does. And the policies, therefore, he recommended would have kept us away from this war. It would have saved Europe. It would have saved Ukraine. That's not what the Europeans did. Yet they sanctioned him. He can't travel. They seized his bank accounts. A colonel which used to work with NATO. What? This is just, it's so dark. I mean, for me, this is a big nail in the coffin of the EU, and they did this to themselves. It's shocking. But anyways, my question was, how do you make sense of this? Because if you're losing a war, the deal is going to be worse tomorrow than it is today. Why would you still want to prolong this? It is a difficult thing to comprehend, I think.
Well, depends on which Europeans. So if you take the 160 million called Russians and Belarusians, well, the Belarusians are kind of and still in neutral, pseudo-neutral mode. The 150 million Russian Europeans, mostly Europeans, are looking at it and going, "We'll settle this on the battlefield." I think the 18 or 19 million Ukrainians are split between those psychotically wishing to fight to the end and those are just wishing for this to be over in any which way possible. As for the rest of Ukrainians outside of Ukraine, because Ukraine itself, it's a three-tier society. The three-tier war. You have the lower middle class and lower, they're the ones fighting and dying because they can't afford to buy their way out. The middle class has bought their way out, become refugees, and are now the uber patriots to fight to the very last Ukrainian because it's not them. And then the rich are just partying everywhere they want to party. They don't give a damn. It's all a good party. They've stolen so much money. They're willing to spend it on the poor Central and Western Europeans and their resorts by buying up their trinkets and buying up their services. Here, come over here, French servant, come bring me my drink because I'm the rich Ukrainian. So it's a very different society, very tiered society. As for the Austro-Hungarian contingent, well, the Austrians so far are still pro-war, but the Conservative Party did win the majority. I think they're going to have the uber majority in the next election, so they'll be out and they'll follow the Czechs and the Hungarians and the Slovaks out the door and saying goodbye. We're not going to fight this war no matter what, which is going to be a hit for NATO too. If you think about it, those armies are not going to fight. Well, and Austria is neutral anyways. Well, not NATO. If for NATO itself, the Turks aren't going to fight. I'm not calling them Europeans, but they're not going to fight. The Greeks will have a revolution. The Bulgarians will have a revolution. The Romanians may have a revolution because they did actually vote not to have any of this, and their elections were stolen, as we saw blatantly. The Italians are starting to distance themselves. I think they figured out that they're standing on a precipice, and their toes are already hanging over the cliff, and it's just a nice gust of wind, and they're going back over that cliff. But Italy has rarely finished a war on the same side it started it. It's like hasn't ever. So there's that. Matter of fact, when I was in Bosnia, the Italians were the first ones to have Velcro patches, and the joke was, it may piss off some of the Italians that know me. Sorry, but that was the joke that we had was the reason to have Velcro patches because Italy's finished every world war on a different side than it started on, so they could quickly switch patches. Whose side are we on today? Oh, okay, new patch, and then we go forward. And then when you get down to the others, well, Germany is a good question because while everybody focuses on the alternative future for Deutschland being 27% and probably higher, there's a flip side to that. The rest, so around 70%, they give their voice to any other party, are giving their voices to war. The majority of the population still wants war. Whether they fully realize that or not, that's a separate issue. But they're voting for war. And the problem. And now you're getting into the problem of the Scandinavians, the pre-Balts, the Poles, and the Northern Europeans, and the leadership that runs in the EU-SSR Politburo in Brussels. The last thing they desperately can accept is any actual peace in Ukraine, because if there's an actual peace and borders are set and the conflict ends, what have they got left to unify the bankrupt, corrupt, degenerated, and socially degenerate, infrastructurally crumbling, economically destroyed European Union? Without the Red Scare, if you want to call it the Russian scare. Okay, so the Russians have just concluded a peace treaty. Everybody's backing off. They got a hard border. The war is over. The Russians are coming. The Russians are coming. Well, that doesn't work anymore. Oh, why did we bankrupt your economy? Why are your children going hungry by week 3? By the way, that's the average Italian these days. I have several friends in Italy that in Italian politics I've talked to, and they're like, the average Italian can't is deciding to heat his home or feed himself and his family by week 3 of the month, and it's only getting worse. Try explaining that. Maloney, by the way, who's number 1 cheerleader for NATO after she got elected, now has to explain why we gave a lot of equipment, maybe had quite a few Italians killed. The French have definitely been getting killed, and the Poles have been getting killed, and so have the Germans while we're at it. And bankrupt their economy. Let's see. I don't know. What else are they going to say? We put everything on red 5, so even if it was red 6, it wasn't a win, and we didn't get red 5. In fact, the roulette wheel just went away, and the ball flew off somewhere, and we're just stuck with our bets on red 5 getting taken away. So we're all bankrupt now. Thanks. We're going to leave for America. And I'm sure quite a few of those leaders probably will leave for America or Canada or somewhere else, run for their lives with their money. I don't see how the European Union gets out of this alive, at least not in the form that it is now, unless it goes full Third Reich tyranny. Concentration camps, gulags are war camps. I'm talking straight up concentration camps, full repression, full on everything. That's the last desperate hold on power. And the weaker the government, often, or the weaker they feel, the more harsh their terms are toward their own population, because they have to crush anything that looks or smells like dissent. And that's what we're seeing in the EU. It's revving up. They're getting more desperate every single day. And you're right about the colonel. Now, there was a Turkish journalist. I cannot remember his name right now, in Germany. He's a perfect example. He's Turkish by race. He is German, born in Germany, and he's sanctioned. The man is living, basically, he's been ghosted. He's not the only one. There was, by the way, another Swedish journalist. She's been sanctioned too. She's in Africa. She can't fly into Switzerland because she has to fly over European Union territory. So now she can't go home. So we're looking at this is right now. It's starting at the top level. They're grabbing the dissidents, the bigger dissidents, but it's going to go further down low, which we already see in England. By the way, England is well ahead by at least a few years of the European Union. England is on full-on tyranny. Anything you say. I mean, look at George Galloway, for God's sakes. The man was a part of Parliament for 30 years. He's head of a recognized registered political party. And he and his wife were coming in, and they were detained, which is worse than being arrested, because arrested, at least you get a solicitor. Here, you're detained. You get no solicitor. You get nothing. You are at the mercy of the state because you're not arrested. You're detained. Just in detention, we can do anything we want, basically. You have no rights. And the UK is a full-on tyrant, but I don't think that's going to go for the rest of the EU. I don't think there's an off-ramp for them, because any off-ramp is a loss of power, and probably a loss of the EU, at least as we see it now. It'll have to be reformed soon. I don't think these people are ready to let go, especially the money that they're making. I mean, they're all making money. Let's not forget that. They have power, they have money, they have prestige, at least in their circles. That's very hard to give up.
I think it's important to know Well, also recognize that this is not the end stop, as you suggest. That is, if you remember when they started this deplatforming and censorship, it was a controversial thing. But first they rolled out Alex Jones because he said some
Mhm.
appalling things, and everyone kind of say, "Yeah, this is goes too far. Let's deplatform him." That's a nice different word than censorship, and uh, and of course, the assumption then, seemingly was that okay, this will be a once-off, but instead it opens the doors, and now this is a common thing. People just disappear off Twitter and or disappear off YouTube or any other channel, and there's no recourse. There's nothing you can do. This has just become the new normal thing that people are deplatformed, and I think it prevents us from actually resolving this thing as well. And it's just so incredible how we're actually here now. If you remember back in the 90s, this was a common this debate we had, especially in the United States, the discussion, but also many Europeans were worried about this. That is, if we insist on as developing a Europe without the Russians, that is an unwillingness to pursue a mutually acceptable European security architecture after the Cold War, we're going to end up in another conflict. As George Kennan said, if we expand NATO, we do this at some point, the Russians will then lash back, they will react, and once they do, we're gonna have all these people on our side saying, "Oh, that's just how Russians are." This is pretty much spot on. This was in '98, and and of course, the frontline states, once you revive the Cold War logic, would suffer greatly. Then, Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia. It's important to recognize this to restore diplomacy, but it's impossible to make this argument in Europe unless you want to be smeared, censored, cancelled, and now, of course, also sanctioned. I mean, this is yeah. What happened to Colonel Wu is incredible. This is gonna it's gonna be again another step towards the EU's irrelevance. Anyways, on that not so happy note, thank you very much for taking the time. I know you're very busy there in the holidays ahead of New Year's and Orthodox Christmas, so thank you.
Well, thank you, and I hope, I do hope this year brings sanity. What's the Chinese animal this time? The horse? So, well, hope the year of the horse, or the stallion, whichever it is, brings a lot more sanity to Europe than has been for the last 3 or 4 years. So we'll live and see. But hope for the best, prepare for the worst.